next up, Rick is going to talk a little bit about some of the cultural management practices that he's been working on with growers primarily, looking at managing common scab, and then I'll roll into some of the stuff that I've been doing through Maine. Take it away, Rick.
Thanks, Ryan, and good morning, everyone. Great to see a lot of familiar faces. I'm just going to chat a little bit about some of the work we've been doing with Living Labs and with the cluster projects with growers in their fields, so mostly splits, and looking at three main, I guess, parameters, you could say. One is the crop grown prior to potatoes. Another one would be supplemental irrigation, and then a final one would be some of the tillage aspects. And there's different people involved in each of those aspects. So we have a little bit, as I mentioned, work with Living Labs. And then Claudia was leading the Common Scab Hort Cluster. A lot of the growers that were involved, especially with the East Prince Environmental Association, and John Phillips helped a lot coordinating those. Myself and my team, and then Yifan and his team did a lot of the irrigation work. And Judith, who's our nutrient management specialist, did some of the tillage stuff that you'll see. And then Claudia, of course, is specifically looking at scab. And then our crew at Harrington, and Scott coordinates the Living Lab. So a lot of people involved, and everyone's kind of looking at different aspects when we do this field work in growers' fields. So it's great to have all this participation amongst the growers and the different research groups. So essentially, like I mentioned, we've got splits according to those three pillars. We usually sample at tuber initiation, soil sample, because that, like Claudia mentioned, was a key time for infection. So we want to get a handle on what some of the soil properties and characteristics are then. And then we also sample from the soil sample from the same strips that we harvest from. And then those tubers, you know, we do look at yield and so forth, but mainly we're rating those for soil-borne diseases, typically common scab, but we look at black scurf and silver scurf and some of the other blemish diseases too. I'm not going to talk much about scab because Claudia's already really done a really nice overview, so the only thing I might mention is going to chat a little bit about the warm, dry aspect that she talked about at tuber initiation especially, and also just talk a little bit about, you know, the infection at that time period being pretty critical. So backwards there. Just a little bit on black scurf. Rhizoctonia can infect, of course, the underground parts like your underground stems and stolons, and can prune off your sprouts. So definitely a yield robber. And then at harvest time, you can see these black scurfs on the tuber. That's the resting structure. Sometimes if you leave those tubers in the soil for a considerable length of time before they're harvested, there's more of a chance for those black scurfs to form, because it's the way the fungus survives the winter. So the longer they're in there, usually you'll get a little more black scurf. And then of course in the spring, if there's conditions that really delay emergence, cooler, wetter conditions, say, you'll get more of that cankering happening too. So we do have a quick peek at rhizoc in some of this work as well. So let's just look at crop grown prior to potatoes. And here in 2018, we had 4 growers participate. And you can see the column there on prior crop. And then we have a little bit of a comment on soil organic matter, soil pH, because as Claudia mentioned, pH is often a very important characteristic, and then some common scab data. So grower A there, you can see the prior crop was either buckwheat or sorghum sedum pearl millet combination, and you can see we had a significant uptick in the pH with buckwheat, which you might think would increase scab, but when you see the scab results, we actually had a significant decrease. And we do find that some of these suppressive crops, like your mustards and buckwheats, which also suppress other pests and pathogens like wireworm and rhizoc and so on, actually do contribute to some good suppression of scab as well. It's not always the case. Whenever you look at scab, the one thing you can guarantee is that you can always find an exception to the rule, but for the most part, part, it seems to provide some benefit. In the second grower there, we have ryegrass compared to a 13-way mix. And you can see there's an uptick in scab with the ryegrass and some suppression with the mix. That's another trend that we see when there's grasses in the rotation, particularly ryegrass, sometimes sorghum sudan. There tends to be a little increase in scab. There's, I think, a carbon connection there. Other people have noticed this, and Claudia commented on carbon too. It seems like grass carbon, especially when you'll see later in the res till situation, sometimes can cause an uptick in the scab. A grower in Emerald mentioned that it seems to happen more when that grass residue isn't incorporated quite properly and you have direct contact with some of those tissues with the tubers. And of course the scab organism can survive in those residues. So there's certainly situations where we do see that uptick, particularly with the grasses. So the type of residue can be really important then in terms of the scab level. Grower C there, we have single mustard versus double mustard. And you can see that we're getting some benefit with the double mustard compared to the single in reduction in scab and some pH decrease there. And the last one there is clover versus sorghum sudan. And we're getting some benefit from the sorghum sudan in this case. But like I said, for the most part, we find that actually the grasses do the opposite. Here in 2019, we have grower A there with double mustard versus the sorghum sudan. And you can see the mustard helping us with common scab and with black scurf in that field. Field B, Ranger russets, really no story to tell there. In the C field, we have that's black peas and wheat. And you can see that we're getting that uptick with the wheat, both in pH and with the common scab incidence. And finally, we have single mustard versus the sorghum sudan there. And again, we're getting some significant reduction in common scab with the mustard. So it looks like there's something there when you look at prior crops. So just in summary then, of the crops we've looked at, some of these like buckwheats and mustards do seem to be helpful at suppressing scab. And not all soil organic matter leads to increased scab. It really depends on the type of the matter, and that's an important message I think here. And it does seem that the grasses sometimes contribute to an increase in disease. As a rule, if you look at the soil pH, you know, it's a bit of a mixed bag. Sometimes it leads to increased scab, but it also depends on other things. And what I often find, and Claudia mentioned this, is that it's the dramatic change in the pH that's most important, not the actual number. She mentioned the number 5.2. And if you're getting that low, obviously you're going to have impacts on your crop in terms of nutrition. That's too acidic. But most of our soils are like high 5s, low 6s. Those can be fine. It's the situation where there's a sudden change in the pH that seems to be critical. So for example, I've seen fields where there's an old manure pile in one corner, and the pH there is about 6.4, but most of the rest of the field is about 5.8. Well, there's always a lot of scab in that higher pH in that field because it was a dramatic change from what was typical in that field. That's the kind of situation that I'm talking about. And because of that quick change philosophy, moving your application of lime or whatever earlier in the rotation, prior, you know, not right before potatoes, can be helpful so that you're not seeing that dramatic change when the potatoes are there. So that's just a bit of a comment on pH. Just chat about irrigation for a bit. So this is with Yifeng, who's our irrigation or water management specialist. So here we have a couple of years of different growers. And the irrigation regime is either dry land or DL there, or the farmer irrigation protocol. And then Yifeng had some of his own protocol there, the Yifeng I. And basically he was trying to go with his soil moisture measurements to dictate irrigation specifically, and was also trying to reduce the amount of times he irrigated to get the right level. And anyway, you can see the story is sometimes consistent, but as usual with scab, there's some variability too. So in field A, like you would expect, there's a reduction in scab with the irrigation. In 2019 field A, this was really dramatic. You can see, super reduction in scab wherever there's any irrigation compared to the dry land. But then you go down to field B there, and there's a bit of an uptick in one of the approaches, although those levels are all pretty low. In field C, again, kind of a contrary result, a bit of an uptick there with some of the irrigated stuff. In field D, really there's too low a scab to make a comment in that field. Look at 2020, field A, pretty much what you'd expect, some reduction with the irrigation as a rule. Nice reduction in field B with the clear waters there. Dramatic reduction in scab where there's irrigation. Pretty good story with Dakotas there. The level's low, but there is some reduction with the irrigation. However, in field D there in the Mountain Gems, it's variable, right? You see some variable results with a bit of uptick in sometimes when there's irrigation. That's one of the things that you might find frustrating about scab, and I'll talk a little bit about some of that variation in a minute. 2021, we've had 4 growers again, so Alverstone's there. Again, pretty low levels, but a bit of an uptick there in Yifang's, one of his trials. Pretty low levels overall in some of the black scurf there, but you can see in field B we had some pretty good reduction with the irrigation, and again, pretty low levels in the other fields to really tell much of a story. But as a rule, we're getting some reduction here in field D and Rhizoctonia as well. So, if we try to summarize some of those results over the years, and that's 13 fields we looked at over 4 years, most of the fields, some form of irrigation definitely reduced scab. In one field, you couldn't see a treatment effect, but in 4 fields, there was kind of a lot of variability. And one thing we didn't really mine out of this data yet, we've got a lot more work to do, is, okay, well, what was the timing of the irrigation? So we don't have that information. So we talk about, the importance of the tuber initiation time period, and how some varieties might, set more closer to one time, other varieties might spread that time out. And if you can keep your water level consistent over a longer time period, it's probably going to be beneficial. So that might cause some of the variation we're seeing. And the other thing is we don't have any data on the natural rainfall during those years and how that might have impacted the results. So some of that variability is probably just because we haven't really gotten deeper into the data that is available. So hopefully we can continue to look at that over time. And of course there's going to be influences of variety and some of the soil properties. And as Claudia talked a lot about, the variability in the pathogen itself is a challenge always. Just the final comments about tillage. So this is with Judith and some of her team. So a few fields here in 2019. And I don't have some of the data on the prior crop here or the potato variety. But we do have moldboard plowing as a rule versus some kind of a residue tillage approach. And over the years that we've been looking at tillage, it's a mixed bag. Sometimes you'll see, for example, in field B there, reduced tillage gives you a reduction in scab. But we also see the opposite, where reduced tillage, and you can see in field C and D, causes an uptick in scab. And some of that is probably due to the type of debris that we're dealing with. And I don't have that data here. I still have to get that from the growers and Judith to see whether there's a correlation with the type of matter that we have there in some of these results. In 2020, scab and black scurf, so you can see that in field A, a bit of an uptick with black scurf in the res till. Field B, pretty much no effects there. In field C, an uptick on scab in the res till. And finally, in 2019, bit of a reduction in the res till in field B, an uptick in field C, and an uptick in field D. So you can see how, if we summarize some of this, there's a bit of variability. Finally here in 2020, a bit of an uptick there in field A, and also in field C with the scab and the residue tillage. If I try to summarize that, so with 10 fields that we've looked at over these 3 years, but we looked at a lot of fields before this too. Most of the fields we didn't really see an impact, but in 30% of the fields we did see an increase. And obviously res-till and some of these approaches are super valuable for organic matter, for maintaining moisture, all these good things, but we just maybe have to tease out how to approach the scab aspect and how that maybe relates to the type of residue that we're dealing with, and as one grower in Emerald said, how it's incorporated and so on. And there does seem to be a bit of that carbon connection with the scab increase in some of these residues. So if I were thinking about scab as an IPM kind of person or lens, some of our diseases, we can have 1 or 2 approaches, maybe a good product, and manage it pretty successfully. Common scab, it's really difficult that way. You really do need a combined approach to have best success. The first box I would check is the tolerant variety. If you're able to use one of those, that would be your first best approach. The second box I might check, if you're able to use some kind of supplemental irrigation, that would be beneficial. Then looking at some of these suppressive crops in the rotation, trying not to get a rapid pH shift. If you start checking off some of those boxes in whole as a holistic approach, you're probably going to increase your odds of getting successful management. It's not something that's ever a guarantee, like most things in life, except for death and taxes, I guess, right? Maybe tariffs. But as a rule, it's kind of that approach where you increase your odds the more of these things that you can include. So I think that's all I'm going to chat about now, Ryan. So Ryan's going to talk about minuet, but does anyone have any thoughts about cropping systems and impacts on scab, maybe from your own experiences?
Questions or comments for Rick?
In the trials with the different, in your first slides with the different cover crops,
Yep.
Were they side by side or they were different fields?
Those are splits.
They're split trials?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So a lot of the growers have been great to try some of these different approaches, and it's, we do this at a smaller scale in Harrington too, so we do have lots of rotations there that have been going on for quite a while in small plots, but it's always nice to go out in the field in a large scale and sample from that and see the impact. I don't know, there was a pretty significant uptick in the use of some of these crops in the last number of years, but I think, Ryan, you were saying that perhaps that's reduced a bit now with some eggworm, some of the wireworm maybe approaches now have changed a bit.
The mustard buckwheat acreage has declined a bit, but not saying that, some people are thinking of taking it back up again or just mixing it, making sure they don't become too dependent on Samegra. But the benefit of things like mustard and buckwheat is they don't just work on wireworm.
That's right.
It's verticillium and some of these other diseases.
Yeah, exactly.
Black scurf, like we were talking about.
Yeah.
Things.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
When they was looking at the irrigation, were they looking at just soil moisture levels or the size of the tube, and trying to match the irrigation with tube initiation? Or was it just
No, it's basically soil moisture levels, yeah. I came in after the fact.
right?
If I was involved, right, you're right, I mean, that
Yeah.
tube initiation timing is so important, but no, that wasn't the case here.
And those weren't like scab only trials
No.
either, right? Like this was that was added to a bigger part of an
Yeah.
irrigation trial.
Right,
too.
yeah, so it was just gonna be for scab, and
Yeah.
a little bit more.
Exactly.
Tube initiation as opposed to moisture.
Right, that's right. Good point. And I should mention with the res-till stuff, one thing you can always guarantee is the yield's better. Always. If you're looking at just overall yield, But the moisture retention and stuff, it's always fantastic compared to the moldboard plow. But it's just managing some of the residues properly.
No slants and dunks and everything usually, we just have to keep adding on top.
That's right.
So those tillage trials, they weren't solely looking at Scab because, yeah,
No.
if you're doing it with Scab, you'd only use sensitive varieties.
Yeah.
If you're doing mountain gems, it's not gonna show up in mountains. Alberzones is gonna show up in alberzones.
There you go.
You
That's,
know, Judith had a bunch of residue tillage trials over the last, probably actually 5 or 6 years with growers, living labs, non-living labs. And then Tyler had a bunch with the province, and I had a few, and we actually did a bit of put a bunch of that data together 5 or 6 years ago, and generally showed what Rick said, is that, you know, most of the time there's no difference in Scab. Once in a while there is. Usually when there is, it's usually after a massive influx of carbon, you know, like you're putting a lot of dry carbon in, and when you're mixing that dry carbon in, and there would be a little bit more influence of Scab. But if you're able to not have just a massive amount of carbon, usually doesn't seem to be much difference. So.
but like you say, there's better choices now for varieties that have some tolerance, which is nice because there didn't used to be much. Russell Burbank, you know, if you read about it in the CFMA description, it says it's moderately resistant, but we see lots of Scab on Russell Burbank. So.
Well, until the last couple of years, like, you know, you'd see Scab on Russell Burbanks, but you would, oh, it wouldn't be as bad as some of the others. And then some of the scabbiest potatoes I saw the last couple of years were Russell Burbanks.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
it just depends. Maybe it's genotype by environment interaction there too. So, all right, thanks, Rick.